Today our paper track is on international issues. We have three excellent presenters scheduled. The first is Ms. Monica Ruiz. She is an expert contributor of the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, and she works in the ICT Applications and Cybersecurity Division. Before that, she was the first graduate to be sent to Tallinn, Estonia as part of the US's Boren Fellowship Program, and her studies have centered on international security and conflict resolution and conflict negotiations, with a focus on cybersecurity policy and strategy. With that, please join me in welcoming Monica to the stage.
Good morning. Thank you, Dr. Maxwell, for the kind introduction. My name is Monica Ruiz, and I will be presenting my report on the establishment of U.S. voluntary cyber defense units. However, I'm also here to emphasize the need for us to do so. To begin, the internet began its development around the 1950s. It took off by the 1980s, and it was more widely used by the 1990s. But with an increase in usage came the higher possibility of threats. Particularly in 1998, there was this incident called Moonlight Maze. It is one of the first sophisticated cyber incidents that came about. For no particular rhyme or reason, but just to provide one additional incident in addition to many that have been taking place, is the 2013 Target data breach. More relevant to folks here in this audience is the OPM data breach that took place in the summer of 2015. Millions of former and current government employees were affected by this. And more recently, you have the WannaCry and NotPetya ransomware incident. The point here being, threats have existed since the beginning, and so we should also build up our defenses to address them. The agenda is as followed. I will look at current US cyber defense efforts, then I will go into the Estonian Defense League and then its substructural unit, the Estonian Defense League Cyber Defense Unit. I will then go into different voluntary efforts that have taken place here in the States, both in different timeframes and in different domains. Then I will look at theoretical structures of how we can apply this in cyberspace. And I will end with the proposition of the US cyber defense units and the specifics of what that entails. So, a lot of these efforts, as you can see, they're not meant to be all-encompassing, but rather capture different initiatives that have taken place here in the States that still play a role today. However, as you can see in terms of a main takeaway is that there still exists a large pool of untapped talent that we could potentially pull from for US cyber defense efforts. Particularly in a 2013 Senate Armed Services Committee hearing, upcoming keynote speaker and former commander of US Cyber Command, retired General Keith Alexander, testified in front of Congress. And he said that his team was already exploring ways that both the National Guard and the Department of Defense may be able to contribute and support US Cyber Command. This led to the National Defense Authorization Act of fiscal year 2014 and the requirement to both DoD and National Guard to assess the role they could potentially play in DoD cyber missions. This, of course, gave fruit to the Cyber Mission Force that's set to be ready by fiscal year 2018. So to provide some background on the composition of the Cyber Mission Force, it is set to be 133 teams, composed of 6,200 cyberspace personnel, and of that, a 2,000 reserve component. What I'd like to highlight in this effort is that although this is critical in terms of beefing up our cyber defenses here in the States, it's more of a whole-of-government approach, but it still lacks whole-of-society engagement. So the Estonian Defense League is a volunteer national defense organization. It's replicated from the 17th century US Minuteman framework. In fact, when speaking with a lot of Estonians during my fellowship, oftentimes they would make that reference. It was established in 1918 and later re-established in 1991. So this gives it deep roots within Estonian society. What I find particularly interesting is that in their National Defense Development Plan from 2013 to 2022, the EDL, the Estonian Defense League, has assumed full responsibility for territorial defense. And so this is a volunteer national defense organization that is now one of the most accountable stakeholders in Estonian national sovereignty. Its substructural unit of many, but the one we're looking at today, is the Estonian Defense League Cyber Defense Unit. And this serves as an extended response capability to cyber defense in Estonia. In terms of background, Estonia, after the fall of the Soviet Union, was already looking for ways to contribute as more than a member to the eastern periphery of the alliance. And so this allowed them to propose the establishment of a cyber defense center, which is now known as the NATO CCD-COE. Of course, at the same time, there was talk about establishing the Estonian Defense League Cyber Defense Unit in order for it to serve as a recruitment branch for the center, but also as a possibility to foster public-private cooperation and allow members of society at large to engage in cyber defense on a voluntary basis. Of course, all of this was followed after the 2007 incident that took place in Estonia with the relocation of the Soviet War Memorial from the middle of Tallinn to the outskirts of the city. Its composition is as followed. You have volunteer specialists in key cybersecurity positions. You have patriotic individuals with IT skills that can contribute to this effort. And you have experts from other fields that want to become involved and engage themselves. To provide a little bit more detailed background, I divided it up into 4 different quadrants. So I'll be discussing responsibilities, challenges, benefits, and costs. So to begin, responsibilities is twofold, both capacity building and operations. And within that, you have the securing of Estonia's e-lifestyle, distributing of cybersecurity knowledge to build cyber awareness and hygiene in Estonian societies. You have the strengthening of cooperation across sectors, given that all these volunteers come from outside of the public sector to contribute to this very critical mission. And you have crisis management by the protection of critical infrastructure. In terms of challenges, it's twofold. So efficiency, how do you coordinate the time volunteers provide to this effort? And in terms of synchronization, how do you both harmonize availabilities and skill sets when needed? Again, this effort is composed of volunteers, but it's also situation dependent. And so when something happens, the whole unit is not activated, but rather individuals that have the right skill sets to address that incident. In terms of benefits, it's threefold: to the individual, to the main authority, in this case being the Estonian government, and to the employers where these volunteers come from. So to the individual, it's a fulfillment of a sense of duty. It's also access to information and different networks, and it's an opportunity for them to build their own skills. For the main authority, it's the scalability of efforts, and it's cost effective. It also serves as an extended response capability when needed. And to the employers, it's additional training and experience for their employees at no additional cost to them. So in fact, when I spoke to a lot of colleagues when I was in Estonia, they would tell me that employers know of the EDL-CDU, and oftentimes they will promote a lot of their employees to engage in this effort. To provide background on costs, the vast majority is covered by state funds. And in 2015, the budget for the whole Estonian Defense League was 32 million euros. To put that in context, the GDP of Estonia that very year was 22.46 billion. And so really, it's a fractional cost for an overall critical mission. 2 components I'd like to highlight of why the EDL-CDU works is both leadership and communication. And if I may read from my slide from one of the founding members of the EDL-CDU and also a current Estonian parliamentarian, Johannes Kert, he said, "Only passionate leaders can lead volunteers. Particularly for the EDL-CDU, they need a passion for a free homeland." It sounds idealistic, but it works. And in fact, it does work, because after the establishment of the EDL-CDU, it's only grown in size. Also, I'd like to highlight the key component of communication. And so the EDL-CDU is headed by a civilian commander. And oftentimes what he referenced to me is the necessity to foster relationships between him, leadership of the EDL-CDU, and its volunteers. So the success of it is dependent on good leadership and communication. Another forward thinker I'd like to highlight that will then segue into the proposal of the U.S. cyber defense units is former Estonian president, Toomas Hendrik Ilves. And he said, "We have lots of talented people who work in the private sector, and we simply offer them the possibility of working once a week for a more patriotic cause." So let us offer that same opportunity to folks here in the States. So different voluntary U.S. efforts that have worked before are, for example, number one, U.S. Minutemen during the Revolutionary War, and the very framework Estonians reference when they talk about their Estonian Defense League. Then you have the Civil Air Patrol during World War II. It's composed of roughly 150,000 aviation enthusiasts that convinced the government to incorporate them formally, and now they serve as an auxiliary branch to the U.S. Air Force. And more recently, you have the Michigan Cyber Civilian Corps. This serves as a rapid response force against cyber incidents, and it's activated under a governor-declared state of emergency. The main takeaway I'd like to highlight here is that there is shared responsibility and mission of all of these efforts working, and that's the very foundation we can use for the establishment of these U.S. cyber defense units. So I'd like to present the solution by assessing some of the key challenges that we're facing here in the States. So there's resource and talent constraints, particularly in the public sector when attracting folks to look at these issues. There's also competitive private sector salaries that the public sector cannot compete with. There's poor cyber hygiene and awareness in our societies, and there's always a need for more cooperation across sectors. And so the establishment of these U.S. cyber defense unit is aimed to address a lot of these issues and more, hopefully. So some of the theoretical structures for the cyber domain are as followed. And for this, I'd like to highlight the work of Associate Professor and current Estonian Defense League Cyber Defense Unit volunteer, Dr. Ray Notis at Tallinn Technical University. And he divided it up into three different structures: the forum, the cell, and the hierarchy. He explained that the forum is large in size. It's sort of an ad hoc meeting place for like-minded individuals that can share tools, ideas, targets, operations. Then he talked about the cell being a smaller group, either composed of one individual or a small group of individuals that oftentimes know one another. So this allows it to mobilize quickly, but by design, it lacks scalability. And then you have the hierarchy, which is best for government-sponsored groups. It has a clear chain of command, and it can accommodate both the forum and the hierarchy. So this finally leads into the proposed U.S. cyber defense units. My proposal is to have it serve as a cell within the National Guard and under the DoD hierarchy. This will allow the units to be fluid, flexible, and situation-dependent. In terms of authority, since it would be a cell within the National Guard, it would theoretically be afforded the same authorities that the National Guard is afforded. So state active duty status under a governor-declared state of emergency. And also Title 32 or Title 10 activated under either the Secretary of Defense or the President. In terms of civilian leadership, I think it's key to the functioning of the EDL-CDU and the potential functioning of U.S. cyber defense units. It is aimed to tackle the stigma of militarized cyber defense. If I may quote someone who is a board member of the EDL-CDU and current contributor as well, Tanel Tetlov, he said, "The EDL-CDU only receives strategic-level military engagement. It is a testament of their support in the civilian way of doing things." And so I think it's key to also highlight that for the potential establishment of U.S. cyber defense units within the National Guard. In terms of membership, members would not be obligated to engage. Rather, this is an initiative based on willingness and availability coupled with skill. Additional specifics of the U.S. Cyber Defense Unit. To start, mission. So it would be increased participation in crisis management for the protection of critical infrastructure here in the States. It would serve as an opportunity for education, so it would raise society's awareness through trainings and exercises and overall build up cyber hygiene. And in most importantly, it would foster cooperation across sectors and provide a sense of responsibility and ownership to a stable US cyberspace. Feasibility, I would highlight what happened in Estonia in 2007 and what we oftentimes hear here in the States about the potential cyber Pearl Harbor. Some would argue it's happened, some would argue it's yet to happen. The point being, we need to focus on US cyber defense because the need is in fact there. Responsibilities of US cyber defense units is very straightforward. It would be the protection of US critical infrastructure on both a voluntary and solely defensive basis. Of course, when using the Estonian Defense League cyber defense unit model for the US, there's certain challenges, particularly size. Estonia's population, 1.3 million, the US, 321.4 million, in addition to geographic landmass. However, if we structure it at the state level, we can apply a lot of the same frameworks and lessons learned to have something established here in the States. Of course, admittance and clearance is a big hurdle, because oftentimes, well, not oftentimes, but in fact, cybersecurity is one of the most classified areas here in the States, but individuals and potential volunteers would have to undergo background checks. Also, there'd be an interview process for them. But I'd also like to highlight that cybersecurity experts here in the States may already have some sort of experience with the government prior to having left public sector and entering their private sector positions. So theoretically, they could potentially already engage and contribute to this. In terms of weakest link for security, the human element. It's notorious in cybersecurity for it to be the, in fact, weakest link. However, there would be restrictions based on skill and participation. So similar to how the Estonian Defense League Cyber Defense Unit does it, not everybody has access to everything all the time, but rather you have access to what is needed to get the job done once the situation or incident arises. In terms of benefits, it's very similar to the EDL-CDU in terms of the individual, main authority, and employers. So individual, sense of duty, access to information and networks and building of your skills. To main authority, scalability of efforts, it's cost effective. And to the employers, it's added training and experience for their employees. In terms of cost, there would be federal fractional funding, and this would be provided through the state's National Guard. However, I should highlight there's no requirements or trainings offered to the volunteers, and as such, there's no compensation. So this is, again, a purely voluntary effort. What I'd like to highlight, there's also the possibility of sponsorships for different US cyber defense unit efforts. So for example, there's already think tanks or organizations within the state that could potentially host a lot of these events. So there exist threats, needs, and resources in our shared cyberspace. And the US Cyber Defense Unit is, or would be formed to help address these challenges and sort of bridge these gaps. The main takeaway being a stable US cyber space here in the States is not a whole of government approach only, it's a whole of society approach, and it could be an opportunity for a lot of folks outside of the public sector to also assume a role and help. So areas of further study. Should the units be formed and organized under the National Guard or perhaps other programs that currently exist today? What would an organizing construct or standard look like across the board for US cyber defense units across all the states? And also, what are some of the potential legal issues in terms of the state and the federal government in the establishment of these US cyber defense units? But what I'd like to highlight in this regard is the concept is aimed at being constantly tailored and adapted and evolved to constantly meet the US objectives it set out for itself. Sort of like the NIST framework and this being a live document, this would essentially be a live effort in terms of constant evolution. So in closing, I have three main takeaways. There is the need to prepare and adapt to a changing environment. There's need to coordinate for a whole of society approach to cyber defense. And there's also a need to educate our society of best practices and risks in this domain. And the US Cyber Defense Unit would aim to do all three. So I'd like to end with the fact that I don't believe cyberspace is offense dominant as would be believed. Rather, I think it's defense competitive. And so we should build up our defenses to continue tipping that scale. With that, I end, and I thank you. Sir.
Yes, John Petrick from the CyberWire. I was wondering if you could give us an example of, take an example of any recent attack against the United States and just sketch out how you think the Cyber Defense Force would respond to such an attack. Pick anyone, pick Sony, pick the hack of the Bowman Street Dam, anything.
Sure. I mean, so again, what I wanted to highlight with the establishment of these U.S. cyber defense units is that you could pull individuals with specific backgrounds. For example, WannaCry, NotPetya. So how can you engage folks that actually have experience in addressing these challenges and activate them to contribute in this effort? It would not be an activation of the whole source or the whole unit within that state, but rather individuals that have the background and the skills that could potentially address what happened, for example, in WannaCry, the ransomware.
Hey, thanks for the presentation. I think it's a really interesting idea. I think it's also informed by history, and I'm curious if you had done any thought on that. So in all our other domains, there are examples where we have taken the citizenry and applied them to help the government with a bigger problem. The British did it in World War II for their air defenses. They had citizens out with binoculars and using telephones for information. So from a paradigm, it's not new, but it's applied new to this domain. So I'm just curious if you had done any of that thought as a way to kind of help mobilize people that it's not a new thing we're asking to do. It's a very common thing that we've done in common defense. It's just applying it now to this new domain. Thanks.
Sure. Well, the slide that I showed on prior voluntary U.S. efforts tries to capture that a bit more in terms of what voluntary efforts have happened before and how they've worked and evolved. So, for example, the Civil Air Patrol and how it was composed of roughly 150,000 aviation enthusiasts that convinced government to formally incorporate them. And now they serve as an auxiliary branch to the U.S. Air Force. So I think, pulling from these examples that have in fact happened in different domains and in different timeframes could aid the establishment of these U.S. cyber defense units, because all in all, if there is a shared mission and responsibility to the stability of your cyberspace, folks would want to engage. And if you're a cybersecurity expert in company X, you can't necessarily join the National Guard or join the military or the reserve component because that is your job. So what can you do to contribute to this shared mission of a stable cyberspace? So it would be, in my opinion, the establishment of these voluntary units that would allow him or her to contribute. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Monica. Fantastic presentation. Our next speaker is Mr. Siim Alatalu. Siim joined the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence as the head of international relations in January of 2015. As a member of the directorate, he's in charge of the center's relations with its growing network of partners from government, military, academia, and industry. Prior to that, his work has included several advisory and managerial positions at the Estonian Ministry of Defense, and between 2008 and 2011, he served as a diplomat at the Estonian delegation to NATO. Please join me in welcoming Siim to the stage.
Okay, well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a distinct pleasure to be here, and thank you to Paul for the kind introduction. It's been a very interesting conference so far. I've taken a huge amount of notes, and it's been really about great statements, great quotations. So if I may start my presentation with a quote from President Reagan, after whom the facility is named. When we're discussing the future of cyber conflict, President Reagan has said that peace is not the absence of conflict. Peace is really about the ability to handle conflict by peaceful means. The presentation, the paper, it was about a supranational issue, so relations between nations. So we shall elevate the discussion a bit from the Estonian and US national cyber defense debates to what happens at NATO. So the title is The Growing Need for a NATO Cyber Command. Now, nations around the world are discussing and are establishing cyber commands. It's, how to say, a new game in town. And there has been less debate about whether NATO as the alliance should have a joint central cyber command. So in the presentation, I shall provide you with some food for thought in that regard. However, before we can get into the actual topic, when I was preparing the presentation, I realized that in the past couple of months, so since submitting the paper, actually quite a lot has changed around us. So for starters, let's discuss what is then the real big picture. What is the area of work for the proposal I shall be making? Now, the growth of cyberspace, it's been very rapid, it's been great. I think CyCon US this year actually has been the historic mark when we have seen that now every second person on Earth is online. So we've seen a huge number of people being connected to each other, and we've also seen a growing number of devices being connected to each other. What we just learned in the previous keynote session is that actually, and what I learned, I need to redraw the graph because this here shows that the estimate was only 50 billion devices, and we were discussing 126 billion devices being online shortly. Nations around the world are doing something about this situation, so new strategies are being drafted, new laws are being put in place, cyber commands are being established, and also many nations around the world are having a offensive cyber capability declared. Now, if you ask me for a list, so who are these guys, who are these countries? I cannot share it with you now, but of course there is this usual list of suspects whom you, I guess, might be familiar with. And furthermore, cyber is all the time in the news. So here are some pictures from newspapers in the last couple of years. So for example, President Putin is quite often on the news in regard to cyber. The OPM hack, that's a how to say historic overview of what Russia has been dealing with when it comes to cyber attacks. The Ukrainian power grid outage, actually 2 times now, 2 Christmases, taking us back a year to the previous CyCon US. So that is what happened then, the big DIN or Mirai botnet attack. And I guess the latest big news is that actually now the European Union is claimed to be discussing whether cyber attacks can be an act of war. So just think of it, the European Union, an economic union of countries, is discussing whether an act of war could be considered in terms of cyber attacks. And of course, around us every day, every minute, there are those user-level threats, anything from viruses to for example, USB sticks carrying something bad. The latest big thing is, of course, the ransomware. We've seen in the past couple of months, last summer, how this can really become a global problem. So that is then the threat picture in general. And if we also take into account the European Union view, so you might know that Estonia is actually this semester holding the presidency of the European Union. So as an economic organization, these are the 4 core things which EU sees as the big threats in cyberspace. Intellectual property theft, personal data compromises, global skills gap, and also the fact that really cyber crime has become a very profitable business model if you want to pursue that. Here are some facts, some figures for you to take away. It comes from a recent survey at the EU, so you see the figures are quite staggering. And I guess what could be the most intimate cyber threat for an, how to say, average user or a organization is really the bottom one. So every day we are experiencing at least 4,000 ransomware attacks. So it's really not a nice area to work with. In a way, it's how to say, it's getting worse every day, and therefore it begs the question whether the organizations, and especially NATO, which brings together the North American and the European allies, could do something about it. Now, NATO has had a story of cyber on its agenda since 2002, but it really took off in the last couple of years. So the Wales Summit 2014, this is where NATO actually agreed on the level of heads of state and government that cyber could be the basis for a Article 5 situation. So one for all for one, if so decided. And furthermore, just last year at the Warsaw Summit, NATO also declared the cyberspace to be an operational domain for itself. So just think of it, cyberspace has been basically put on the same level as land warfare or air warfare or naval warfare or space war, if you will. And then that of course begs the question, how should NATO really operationalize this pledge by the head of state and government, and whether an institution such as the NATO Cyber Command should be now established. Now, there have been some proposals in the public, notably by former SOCURs, for example, that really this is an area that the alliance should be taking seriously and should be establishing new mechanisms, new structures for. But so far it hasn't happened. So really the paper was a hypothetical scenario discussion. At NATO, everything needs to be discussed based on a consensus, and that might take some time before all the 29 capitals really agree on something they can agree on. And furthermore, it will, regardless of whether the decision will be taken sooner or later, it will be a very multi-layered challenge for NATO because, well, first of all, there is no universal definition of cyberspace. Yes, NATO declared it to be a domain of operations, but it depends on whom you ask. What is then cyberspace? Is it just a computer, a network, or is it all the connectivity, all the people, so half of the global population? So are they just the devices or are they the actors? And if so, which actors? So the debate can be a very lengthy one. So cyber has no borders. It's already been discussed at this conference as well. It's already been discussed as well that cyber effects can be carried over or transferred in a matter of seconds. So it really is possible to create havoc, to create destruction, loss of property, loss of connectivity, compromise of devices in a matter of quite a small effort if you have the capability. Also on the political level, on the international law level, we discussed yesterday that what has happened at the UNGGE, so there is really no appetite to change the status quo as to what could be the rules of the game. At the same time, there's really no limit to what the threats could be. So previously I showed you just a random list of things, but it's really about the imagination and the innovation which could become threats. Growing interconnectedness, already discussed previously. Also the transatlantic principles of open internet and net neutrality. So unlike in some countries, our countries on the two sides of the Atlantic, we are committed to the internet being a, enabler. So it is for everyone's use. In some countries, of course, the use of internet is blocked. It's controlled by the governments. So it's not a shared story, but it's a shared story on our part of the world. And most recently, as I mentioned, the EU is claimed to be saying that it could be an act of war. The EU just finished and launched its new cybersecurity strategy, which is interestingly called Resilience, Deterrence, and Defense. And why it's interesting is that, well, actually, EU is taking over NATO's language. And resilience, deterrence, well, deterrence has a very specific meaning in regard to nuclear forces. But This has caused some confusion also in Brussels. It has caused some confusion with the Estonian presidency of the EU, and it has caused some confusion at NATO. So what is the EU then talking about? And the EU's actually recipe for deterrence is that you should be able to preempt cybercrime by different means which you have at hand. And that then begs the question, so what is there left to be defended by NATO? Because the EU is also developing its network information security agency into a cyber agency of the Union, and it's really investing into cyber. And if EU is doing the job, is there anything left for NATO to defend? And I think there still is, because what makes and as an interlude, this is a picture of how the two sides of the Atlantic are integrated. You see here, some countries are NATO members only, some are EU members only, but the bulk of them are actually both in EU and NATO. And for the let's say imagery, I just chose to show a shield, which means that they should be then the best protected ones. And if anyone then decides to try something against any of those players, because of the interconnectedness, everyone could actually be threatened and could be a potential victim. And now this then takes us to the operational domain issue and what is really the challenge and what is the possible solution. Now, the challenge of the 5 domains is really that, yes, you can imagine that on land you do land warfare, on sea you don't do land warfare, and so on. But when it comes to cyber, you see that really cyber goes beyond just being a domain. You can also imagine that if you're talking about land warfare, you actually need to have your cyber defenses in place before you let anyone to actually engage with you in the conventional senses. So it's really a 5th domain with a very distinct character, and I think you need to have some out-of-the-box thinking, both for nations and for NATO at large, as to how to then establish the command, which would in principle serve one of the 5 domains, but at the same time it should serve all the 5 domains. Now, the road to cyber conflict. This is adapted from the discussion on Tallinn Manual. This is an escalation curve, and well, the left side from your point of view. Pacta sunt servanda. This takes us back to the Treaty of Westphalia, and really it's the governing principle of the Western societies that the rule of law is in place and agreements are being respected. So if you have a treaty, you respect it. But even if you don't have a treaty, you should at least try to assume how the rules are and respect them. Well, unfortunately, if you think of all the cyber incidents, this is not really the case. Of course, there is no cyber law agreed, but at the same time, not all the laws which are in place are interpreted the same way across the globe. And then the other extreme is, of course, let's call it bluntly, war. So use of force or armed attack, in the worst case, this is the other extreme compared to the ideal life. And well, there is a delineation when peace becomes war, but I think the big challenge with this is that the internationally wrongful acts, this is really the reality. This is where something is being done, something bad is happening, somebody is losing property. Fortunately, no one is losing lives yet, but you never know what we might be dealing with, let's say, and discussing at the next Cyclone US. So it's actually, let's say, the yellow and orange parts are really a huge gray area where things could become debatable, solutions could be debatable, attribution, all that is really a difficult and not black and white solution. Now, that then begs the question, what could be the ends or the objective of the NATO Cyber Command? I've listed here 4 things. I think it really starts with the fact that NATO as a military alliance is hugely dependent on the working of its technology. So the technology which is used, it should be immune to threats. It should be. It depends on the technology, and NATO really needs to work on ensuring that this continues to be the case. Basically, that nobody intrudes your systems and makes your systems unusable or, in the worst case, malfunctional. The second thing, the second objective could be really sending out a political signal of deterrence. It was discussed yesterday at a paper panel here. Deterrence by denial or deterrence by punishment, or then the third option, which was proposed by the speaker yesterday. It is really something that is important and understandable, I guess, for the global community, that if you show that you have credibility in being able to use a certain technology or a certain weaponry against your opponent, then maybe the opponent will think twice before provoking you. And I think this morning, if you've seen the news, President Trump is was in Korea and is now in China, and he has made some very significant statements, which to a former NATO heir sounds like as if, well, now it's really the promise is out there. Moving on, flexible cyber response. This refers to NATO's debates actually in the 1960s. So last year we celebrated the 50-year anniversary of what is NATO's deterrence posture. So on one hand, you need to calm tensions. So NATO is really committed to preempting conflict, making sure that discussion, negotiations, are being taken care of, but at the same time the deterrence part, so the promise of basically being stronger than the opponent is there. Doing that in the cyberspace, well, we can have a separate discussion on the whole cyber deterrence, but I think it's really important to show allied resolve, and that could also be understood not just in the defense or the foreign relations community, but in the global cyber community also, that NATO does have the means at its disposal, and it is ready to act if so provoked. The decision at Wales in 2014, that was, I would say, the introduction to that. But of course, if you want to be credible, you need to have a single unit, a single capability at hand if you want to sound credible. And the fourth objective, I think that's also very important. It goes to another, I would say, way of seeing the challenge. It's really about the gap. And here with NATO, it is the gap in procedures and capabilities. So for example, if you want to declare Article 5 and you want to have a flexible response, then how do you basically do that? NATO, of course, has procedures in place, developed over decades, but the cyber responses as such, they are perhaps not as well advertised. If we just compare it to the EU, so the latest news I showed you about the EU declaring it the act of war. The EU actually just recently approved a set of measures. It's called the Cyber Diplomacy Toolbox, and it really aims to provide EU officials, but also nations, for the scenario where one EU member state or several or a private sector institution is under attack. Then the EU can, for example, on the level of the High Representative, perhaps say that we are concerned, or we are deeply concerned, or so on, all the way to imposing sanctions against the party which has sponsored the attack. So that's one solution which EU now has in place. But there too, they are wrestling with the challenge of how do you basically make it automatic, because you probably don't want to lose any time. when the attack occurs, and the public is looking at the leaders as to what will be then the decision. So these are then the objectives of the Cyber Command. Going further, ends cannot be without ways and means. So here are a couple of the ways by which we could set up the NATO Cyber Command. These are actually models. So NATO Special HQ, so the Special Operations HQ, it's an interesting model by way a cyber command could be considered. So in a way, it's like a coordination mechanism. It reaches out to the national capabilities. They meet, they discuss the situation at hand. If something needs to be done, then there is a mechanism how you reach out to your allies as well as partner countries, and basically can achieve the objective of the mission. Then there is the NATO existing model. NSERC is the NATO Computer Incident Response Cell. It is a 24/7 watch which takes care of the cyber defense of NATO institutions. So basically, we have an institution in place, but there are some buts with it. So it's a civilian institution. It's not in the military command chain. So it could be seen as, not usable by the military commander. So you need to have a special arrangements in place to put the NSERC to do things on top of what their mandate currently is. Then there is the national model. Of course, we can take any national cyber command as a model for the alliance, but there are some weaknesses with this approach because, there's no one size fits all. And with NATO, you always need to consider all the different concerns from different allies. So you cannot really overtake one model that easily. And the last one, this is not in my paper, but it suggests that perhaps we should reach out also to the EU for an example. So the CERT EU is the equivalent of the NSERC of NATO, but they have actually, for the first time now, employed what is a special model to reach out to the national CERTs. And basically, the CERT EU, the European Institutional Cyber Defenders, they are forming a pan-European team with all the national CERTs. And the first time they actually used this and it was considered a success was the ransomware case NotPetya last summer. So Estonia had just assumed the presidency and we made use of these mechanisms and we could support and reach out to other countries in really maintaining the situation under control. So that's then the ways. And I then just have the means to discuss. Of course, we could go into the different technical capabilities, but I think it's not doesn't serve the purpose of this presentation. So we could speak of a NATO-owned offensive capability. So the allies finance or invest into a centralized structure. We could also talk about a coordination mechanism, such as discussed with the NATO Special HQ model. We could speak of the pooling and sharing of the national expertise, perhaps not for the particular operations, but really for training and exercise and networking to ensure that when the need arrives, all the alliance has the same level in terms of the capabilities and the skills of the people. So these are then the means. And if I may just recap, what are then the NATO command structure's responsibilities? They are to deliver military capability of the alliance, and furthermore, they are in charge of planning of operations, conduct of those, development, transformation, and support. So eventually, the way I see it, the NATO Cyber Command would be then a full-fledged military organization. But given the big picture and the need to deal with threats from the civilian cyberspace, if I may call it so, you really need to have an open mindset, a flexible response capability, and really think outside the box. I realize I'm now out of time, but I guess we can perhaps take one question if you allow.
Thank you very much, Peter and team. We need to move forward in the interest of time, but Seem will be around the rest of the day, I believe. And so I welcome you to meet him at a coffee break or during lunch and ask your questions at that time. But thank you very much, Seem, for a wonderful presentation on NATO operations and where we might go from there. All right, our third presenter of the morning is Mr. Peter Stockberger. He's a senior managing associate at Dentons, the world's largest law firm. He's a member of their firm's global cybersecurity group and focuses his practice on cybersecurity and employment litigation and counseling. In addition to that work, he also serves as a virtual fellow with the United States Department of State and is currently an adjunct professor at the University of San Diego School of Law, where he teaches in the area of public, international law, and oral advocacy. So please welcome Peter to the stage.
All right, good morning, everyone. So as you can see from the title of my paper, I am going to be looking at the international law of cyber attribution. So what rules in the public international law space apply and trigger state responsibility and state attribution. And what I posit in my paper is that there's actually a new set of state practice forming that's creating a new rule for state attribution that is changing the pre-existing rule of effective control, which has been around since effectively 1986. So an overview of the paper and the presentation today is I'm just going to go over quickly some basic public international law principles. I don't know how many people in the room are lawyers or know international law, but I always find that it's helpful just to go over the basics. Then I'm going to look through the state practice that I say since 2014 is actually changing the rule. And finally, we'll look at what the consequences or the benefits would be of this new doctrine if it were in fact adopted by states. So the general rule about public international law is it is the law that governs relations between countries. So it's in the sort of name itself, internation law. And there are really two primary sources for international law. And these are called the hard sources of international law. It's treaties, and then it's customary international law. So custom is essentially unwritten rules of state practice that countries are bound to adhere to, even if it's not written down in a treaty. And a common example would be on the law of the sea. Before there was a treaty on the law of the sea, international law required states to fly the flag of their state of origin when they're on international waters. And that wasn't written down anywhere. It was just the practice of states for centuries, essentially, so it developed into custom. In customary international law, which is really the area that I'm looking at, it has two elements. You have to prove both elements in order to establish something is a matter of custom. The first, which is what I focus on in this paper, is state practice. You have to have overwhelming state practice amongst interested states in order to say something is a principle of custom. The second element, which is the harder element to prove, because state practice is essentially an objective showing. It's the physical act of what states do. It's called opinio juris, which is the belief of the states that what they're doing is required by law, which sort of seems circular to where you create law by acting out of a sense that you are legally obligated. But you most often see opinio juris reflected in signing statements to treaties or public statements by officials such as a president or a prime minister at the United Nations, something that reflects essentially what the mental state is of the country when they're engaging in an act. So those are the two elements that you have to prove for custom. And we see this definition of custom reflected in Article 38 of the International Court of Justice, which is the official court for the United Nations. And Article 38, paragraph 1b, defines custom as general practice accepted as law. So that's the two elements right in that formal definition. So what I'm talking about in terms of state attribution, it's the law of state responsibility under international law. So when is a state responsible for a particular act? And the general rule under the Articles on State Responsibility, which is a body of principles that was developed by the International Law Commission and then ultimately adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 2001, And the rule is under Article 2, and a state will be responsible under international law when the particular act in question is attributed to the state, and then 2, if the act, in fact, violates an international obligation. So that's when you would examine what treaty obligation are we talking about, what is the act itself. So I'm focusing on the first element. When is an act attributable to the state? And so this sort of highlights the two prongs for state responsibility, and again, state attribution is what my paper focuses on. So the general rules for state attribution are, under Article 4 of the International Law Commission's draft articles, state organs, the act of a state organ is attributable to the state. That's the general rule that everybody knows, everybody's familiar with. So when the U.S. Cyber Command takes a particular action or the U.S. military takes a particular action, that's attributable to the United States because the military is an organ of the state. The second group are third parties who are empowered by the state to carry out state functions. And Monica was discussing the cyber defense units, or perhaps a cyber defense unit in the United States. That could, in theory, be a group that's empowered by the state to carry out a traditional state function and therefore would be attributable to the state. The third category is what my paper focuses on, and that's third parties. So these are groups or people who are neither organs of the state, nor have they been given the authority by the state under law or under some sort of formal giving of power. And so Article 8 of the draft articles addresses these third parties. And the general rule that Article 8 sets forth is that the acts of a third party will be attributed to the state under international law if they are acting on the instructions of or the direction and control of the state. So this test is the general rule of state attribution for third parties under international law reflected in Article 38. And so what is the direction or control that's required? And there's really sort of three sources, three cases that have come down to explain what this general rule is of direction and control. The first and most important case came down in 1986 by the International Court of Justice involving Nicaragua and the United States. And Nicaragua sued the United States in that case for funding and training the Contras who were attempting to overthrow the Nicaraguan government. And Nicaragua claimed that the U.S. was responsible as a state for the acts of the Contras, so for the violations of human rights law and humanitarian law that the Contras were being alleged to have committed. The court held that even if the CIA and the U.S. government funded the Contras or gave them general manuals on how to overthrow the Nicaraguan government, that was not effective control. They did not direct or control every aspect of the Contras operations, and so it cannot be attributed to the state for those particular acts. The court did find, however, that the U.S. engaged in unlawful intervention, which is a separate issue, which kind of brings in the U.S. election question. But did the U.S.'s actions constitute a separate violation of Article 2.4 of the Charter, separate and distinct from the actions of the Contras? And so this case is important because it establishes the effective control test. And it says you have to control every aspect of the third party's operations to be responsible. You fast forward to 1999, and the appeals chamber for the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia issues this famous opinion in Tadic, where the court rules that when you are dealing with a hierarchical structured group, like a paramilitary group, you don't have to show effective control. You can actually just show overall control. And if the state has overall control over the group and has some level of control, that's still sufficient to establish state attribution under public international law. Fast forward to 2007, the International Court of Justice comes back in the Bosnian genocide decision and basically slams down the ICTY's decision and says, that's not the rule of international law. You're not allowed to talk about what the rules of international law are. We do. So the opinion there reaffirmed the effective control test. And so after this decision, and with Article 8 of the Articles on State Responsibility, the general law of attribution in state and international law is the effective control test. It's what's called the lex generalis, the general law. And the Tallinn Manual 1.0, the first Tallinn Manual that came out, first did something very important. It affirmed that the general rules of international law, which the effective control test would be part of, apply in cyberspace. That's the first thing they stated, which was a very important announcement. With regard to state responsibility and state attribution, the Tallinn Manual endorsed Article 8 and the effective control test. And they said the effective control test and Article 8 apply in cyberspace. You fast forward to Tallinn 2.0, and they again endorse Article 8 and the effective control test. They list out what effective control might look like in cyberspace when the state determines the execution and course of the specific operation, the cyber activity engaged in by the non-state actor, and that the state is integral in that operation. So again, the Tallinn Manual authors endorse the effective control test. That's the lex generalis. And they confirm that there's general support is insufficient, providing malware alone is insufficient, financing and organizing is insufficient. You have to have direction and control. So that's the lex generalis. That's the general law. But if we go back to the articles on state responsibility, Article 55 says that the general law does not apply if a specific law develops in that particular field. And that's the doctrine of lex specialis. And so it's a general legal principle that all nations essentially follow, which is the specific governs over the general. And how does that operate? Well, we can see it. A clear operation was in the International Court of Justice's 1996 advisory opinion on the use of nuclear weapons. And in that case, the court issued an opinion looking at whether the use of these weapons would violate Article 6 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR, a human rights treaty. And Article 6 says you cannot arbitrarily deprive persons of life. The court said, however, that humanitarian law applies when you're in armed conflict. And under the law of armed conflict, you can take life, just with certain restrictions. So there was a specific body of law, a lex specialis, that forms for armed conflict that governs over the general rule of Article 6 outside of armed conflict. And so that's the lex specialis, lex generalis interplay. So to determine whether a lex specialis is forming, which in my opinion it is, you have to go back to, well, what are the elements of determining the existence of a new principle of law? And I'm focusing again on the state practice element of that determination. And what my theory is that since 2014, states, in their public attribution of cyber attacks to other states, they are not using the effective control test. They're not citing direction and control and instructions. Instead, they're using what I call the control and capabilities test, which would be a new test for state attribution. So the lex generalis is the effective control test. Tallinn Manual accepts it. We have you can have a lex specialis under Article 55, and that's what we're going to look at is the state practice. So what are the differences between the two tests before we look at the state practice? Well, the main difference is that there's not an emphasis on instruction or direction in this new test. They instead look to, does the bad actor and does the state, do they share similar malware? Where are the IP addresses located? What's the language used in the attack? And what are the capabilities, technical capabilities, and political motivations? It doesn't involve a hard and fast rule on, did the state direct and control every element of the operation? So let's look at some of the state practice that shows that. Since 2014, we know pre-2014 there was really no formal state attribution in cyberspace. There's been no formal attribution of the 2007 attack in Estonia or the 2008 operations in Georgia. There are rumors, but there's been no formal state attribution. No formal attribution of the Stuxnet attack. There was the report in 2013 that indicated that APT-1 was linked to the Chinese state, and the DoD manual in 2013 effectively endorsed the Mandiant report, but not going full tilt and saying the Chinese state is state responsible for the APT-1 operations. But 2014 is when we get the first state attribution, and that's when the United States, through the FBI, publicly attributed the Sony attack to the North Korean state. And this was the press release, this was the report that the FBI released. So this was the public statement by the FBI. And we see that second sentence is the public attribution. The FBI concludes that North Korean government is responsible for these actions. Under international law, the FBI binds the United States in its public statements. It is an organ of the United States. The bullet points that follow that conclusion, however, do not talk about direction and instruction. They instead talk about the malware is similar to previous North Korean attacks. The overlap in the infrastructure are similar, and they appear to be similar in terms of capabilities and motivations from a previous attack. So again, there's no public statement that the North Korean government gave direction and instruction to carry out the specific elements of the Sony attack. So this is the first example of a state attribution on a lower standard than effective control. The next example is an indictment that came down in 2016 against certain officials linked to the Iranian government for the attacks on certain financial institutions and the attempt to hack into the dam in upstate New York. And the Department of Justice released their indictment, and the indictment lays out why they attribute the state of Iran, these actions to the state of Iran. And they allege that the defendants performed work on behalf of the Iranian government, but the factual allegations in that indictment go to the control and capabilities factors, not direction and control. They said they have ties to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, but again, these conclusions of law they're making are supported by facts that go to the control and capabilities factors, not effective control. They don't ever describe direct instruction or control by the Iranian government. And one of the facts is that one of the defendants received credit from the Iranian government for completion of his military service, and so that shows he has similar interests with the Iranian government. Again, not effective control. Probably the most prominent example that we're all familiar with in this room is the 2016 election public attribution of the Russian state by the US government. And the first public attribution was in October 2016, then followed up by this report by the FBI, in which they publicly attributed the act to the Russian state, and they laid out why the Russian state was responsible for the interference. They stated up front that the U.S. intelligence community, so again, an organ of the state, an extension of the state, is confident that the Russian government directed the operations. But that conclusion of direction is then followed up in the rest of the report, not with evidence of direction, but instead evidence of the control and capabilities theory. That they had consistent methods and motivations of the Russian state. That the motivation was to interfere with the U.S. election process. So they're talking about the motivations of the players, not the direction. They talk about the methods are similar to methods that the Russian government have used elsewhere. And so the final conclusion was the scope and sensitivities involved lead to the conclusion that Russia must have authorized. But again, that's a conclusion based on facts that don't show direction and control. So this was an important public statement, public attribution, but they did not, the U.S. government did not follow the effective control test, which was a change in state practice outside of Article 8 of the International Law Commission's articles. You fast forward to January 2017, and you have the DNI's report on the election interference. And they don't talk about the factual issues of attribution. They only have one paragraph on attribution, and they simply say that the issue of attribution, you have to look at who the likely perpetrator was, their possible motivations, and whether the government had a role in ordering and leading the operation. Well, if you were to follow the general rule of international law, the only question you look at is, did the foreign government order and direct the operation? If you don't have evidence of that, there is no evidence of effective control. There is no state attribution. So again, I think the U.S. government here, whether conscious or not, they are changing state practice in this field of state attribution, and they did so with this press release. We saw it again with the Department of Justice in 2017 indicting certain Russian officials as well as private actors in an indictment relating to the Yahoo breach. And they alleged that the officers of the Russian government conspired together with the criminal actors to and the Russian state was responsible for all of their actions. And their conclusion in the indictment was they linked the criminal hackers to the state by showing that they obtained information that would be of interest to the state, so similar motivations. They looked at the geographic location, so another factor under what would be the control and capabilities test. They then looked at the ability of the state to arrest the hackers. So again, this is not direction and control, but it's showing, well, if the state had arrested them, that means they would have showed they disagreed with the action. So again, it's a flimsy factual analysis, but again, not going to the effective control test. So the May 2017 WannaCry and the June 2017 NotPetya attacks are the most recent examples of state attribution. For WannaCry, Microsoft came out first in October and said based on their analysis, based on the capabilities and the malware used, they blamed the North Korean state for the attack. And they tie it back to the Lazarus Group, which was the same group that the FBI tied the Sony attack to, based on a control and capabilities theory. The UK government just recently adopted Microsoft's analysis and publicly attributed the attack to the North Korean state. But they did not say direction or control, and they did not say methods and motivations. In the NotPetya attack, again, we know what happened. The Ukraine was heavily hit. So Ukraine called for a joint investigation with the US, and NATO came out and said it was likely a state, but then the Ukraine Secret Service came out and publicly attributed the attack to Russia. And they based it on similar motivations, similar code, and similarities in tools and techniques. So public attribution, not based on effective control, but based on a control and capabilities theory. So more state practice. So cases to watch to see whether this state practice continues is the French elections. The French government has indicated that they think that it was the Russian government. They're doing an investigation. If that investigation concludes and the French government does formal public attribution to the Russian state, it'll be interesting to see what the factual basis is that they base that conclusion on. There's the APT-32 that's now operating out of Asia, and there's recent reports that they're attacking the South African government now and the Vietnamese government. So again, these will be new examples and more opportunities for state practice. So what's the impact of the new test? And I'm about to run out of time here. Basically, it makes attribution easy, but there's a lot of risk because of false flag operations, because of spoofing. If you base the attribution on technical indicators and motivations, it's very easy for states to hide their true motivations or use false technical indicators. And so there's a lot of belief that you should stay with the effective control test because that is the most tried and true method of determining state direction and state control. The other challenge is there's a lack of state practice. States have to publicly announce attribution and the reason why they're doing it in order to have both state practice and opinion juris. And until states actually step up and make law, the law will not specialize in the area of cyber law. And that's something that Professor Schmidt has talked about often, where he talks about the gray areas of international law. And he essentially says it's not up to the authors of the Talon Manual to make law or lawyers, it's up to states. And they will decide whether they're going to further this control and capabilities test in the future. Thank you. Sure.
So Peter, in your paper, you talk about the standard of due diligence. I'm curious as to if you can discuss, and maybe it takes a whole semester's class to describe it, but why that is not sufficient to hold states responsible, why we need an additional test in these cases.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the principle of due diligence essentially says that a state cannot knowingly allow its territory to be used to cause harm to another state. So you have to engage in due diligence to prevent that. That's a separate obligation on the state than being responsible for the third-party actor. So for example, if a third state actor or non-state actor, a third party, engaged in a cyber attack from a U.S. territory, there are two potential internationally wrongful acts that the U.S. could be liable for. One is lack of due diligence, which is an obligation on the state. The second would be the state's responsible for that third party's actions. And so whether it's an armed attack or whether it's a use of force, they would be separately liable for that. So what I examine is just on when are you responsible for a third party's actions. Due diligence would be it could be a separate obligation that they'd fail. Great, thank you.
All right, that concludes this morning's session. For those interested, the papers of the authors, if you want to read the full content, is on all the CDs passed out in your bags. Also, in about 4 weeks or so, it'll be up on IEEE Explorer if you have access to that, or you can purchase the papers through there. Now we'll break for lunch from 11:30 to 12:45, and then we'll resume with more breakout sessions. Thank you.